Welcome back, design students. In this video, we're going to create the camera for our scene and animate it. So let's get started. The first thing we're going to need is what's called a level sequence, and we can create that by clicking on this little film slate icon here and selecting Add Level Sequence, and then naming it something. And the next thing we need is not a camera. We're going to have something called a null object or an empty actor that will sort of drive the rotation of our camera. It's going to act as a pivot point around which the camera can rotate. And that can be found here under the Place drop down under Basic Actor. And you just drop it right in the center of your scene, and then try to make sure that it's centered in the turntable and on your lightsaber. You can check that by hitting F on your keyboard and rotating your scene camera around it. It shouldn't wobble or anything like that. And when we created our level sequence, it automatically opened up the sequencer and opened our level sequence. And the sequencer is kind of like the video editing window in Unreal. So let's rename our empty actor here before we go any further. I'm going to rename it Cam Pivot 01. And then we need to create a camera to look at our scene. So let's create the camera in our sequencer here. We can just click this button here, create a new camera, and set it as the current camera cut. And you can see that it sort of generates a video track here, but we need to zoom out some because it zoomed way too close. And you can also see that it put the camera track here, and it put our camera in here as well with some settings. We have aperture and focal length, and we also have a transform setting, and this is what we're going to use to rotate the camera. If you open that up, you'll see that it has location, rotation, and scale. So rather than set a keyframe for each one of these, we can just set one right here at the top. So let's go ahead and click this little button, and you can see that it sets a keyframe. In animation, keyframes mark the beginning and ending value of a parameter, whether it be position, rotation, and scale, or brightness of a light, or the color of something, or anything that you can change in the scene. The computer then figures out how to change that value over time and what to do in between the two keyframes. So the next thing we need to do is parent our camera to our cam pivot. Here's our camera, and we need to click and drag it and drop it right on top of our cam pivot to parent one to the other. And now when we rotate the cam pivot, we rotate the camera, as you can see. Now the next thing we need to do, I'm going to go ahead and close this right here, is add our cam pivot as a track to our sequencer. So I'm going to click and drag it down into the sequencer. And that kind of flipped everything out. So let's go ahead and select this keyframe here for our camera and delete it. Just push delete on your keyboard and close out for a second. And then let's recenter everything. Let's grab our camera pivot here and zoom out and focus on it like so. And then zoom back in here. And as you can see, I'm actually piloting my camera. If you're not sure you're piloting your camera, come up to perspective here and click this so you can be piloting your camera. As long as you see this, you are piloting your camera. This is the cam pivot viewport, and they should be basically lined up. So now we need to add a transform track to our cam pivot. So let's click the plus button here by the track, and we're going to add transform to our cam pivot. And so let's create a keyframe, a beginning keyframe for the camera, and a beginning transform keyframe for the cam pivot. They should both have keyframes at frame 0. Now when we move forward, and I'm going to turn off snapping for rotation here. Now if we select our cam pivot and rotate around the scene and set a keyframe for it, as we move our playhead, you can see we are rotating the camera. So I'm going to undo that keyframe because we want to rotate it a specific amount over a specific number of frames. So to do that, we only have 165 frames in the scene right now. We're going to click right here and type in 400. And that made our zoom bar much smaller, so let's grab it and pull it all the way out again. And then we need to grab this out point. This tells Unreal what we want to render, how much of the timeline we want to render, and drag it all the way to the end at frame 400. And then we also need to drag our camera cut out to frame 400, and you can see the frame that it's on as we're dragging it out. And now on frame 400, we're going to set our final keyframe. So we're going to open up the Cam Pivot Transform track right here. We're going to open up Rotation, and under Yaw, we're going to click here and type in 359. And what that does is that rotates one complete revolution. If we set it to 360, it actually wouldn't go anywhere. It would just assume that it's rotating once and it wouldn't rotate at all. Because on a circle, basically 0 and 360 are the same thing. And when you click play here in the timeline, I'm going to click looping. When you click play, you'll notice that your scene rotates. But notice how it starts off slow, speeds up, and then slows down at the end. This is called keyframe interpolation. The computer, as I said before, has to figure out what to do between the first keyframe and the last keyframe. It has to decide how the scene is going to accelerate or not. The default is something called an S-curve, or easy in out. And we can see that if we click this button here in the timeline. That brings up the curve editor. Here are listed all the things in the track. I'm going to open up the Cam Pivot. I'm going to open up Transform, open up Rotation, and I'm going to select Yaw. And here is the interpolation curve for our two keyframes. And you can clearly see that this starts off slow, accelerates, and then levels off at the end. We want it to run constantly, so we're going to select this first keyframe, and then we're going to go here. These little arrows give us more choices, and we're going to select Linear. And you'll see that that converts that to a straight line. And then we need to do the same thing to this one. And now we have constant motion. Then we need to save this and close it. And now when we play, you'll see that the motion is constant. And our scene is now set up and ready to render. If you want your speed to be faster, we can fix that after we render in Premiere Pro, or you can grab this yaw keyframe you have here and you can drag it closer. If I go to frame 200, it will be twice as fast, as you can see. So before we leave this video, let's go to File, Save All, and when we come back, we're going to render this video out, bring it into Premiere Pro, and create a true looping sequence. And I'll see you then.